Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody in the audience today. I'm Doug Sullivan, president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to today's program. Can Biden's visit create a lasting recalibration in the U.S. Saudi partnership? Now, today we're going to try and decipher why Biden is going to go to Jeddah, what are the goals of his trip, and what he can realistically hope to accomplish. So, with these preliminaries out of the way, let me introduce to you our exceptional panelists. I'm going to go through very short bios, but you can see the full and very impressive biographies of our panelists on AGSIW's website. Mohammed Alyahya is a senior non-resident fellow at the Hudson Institute, where his work focuses on Middle Eastern foreign policy. He's a fellow at the Middle East Initiative of the Harvard Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and a senior research fellow at Gulf Research Center, and I guess just got his PhD. So Mohammed, congratulations. Brian Katulis is a senior fellow and vice president of policy at the Middle East Institute. His past experience includes work at a number of think tanks, but also the National Security Council and the Departments of State and Defense. Brian, we're happy to have you with us. Danielle Pletka is a distinguished senior fellow in foreign and defense policy at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on U.S. foreign policy in general, but Middle East policy specifically. She also teaches at the U.S. Middle East Policy at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Danielle, thank you for being with us today. And the moderator for today's discussion is the irrepressible Hussein Ibish, a senior resident scholar here at AGSIW. He's also a weekly columnist for Bloomberg and The National, and a regular contributor to many, many other U.S. and Middle Eastern publications, radio and TV programs. Hussein, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Doug. So it's great. This is great. Okay, and on another ideal Zoom panel. So this is wonderful. Mohammed, congratulations. It was a master's. Am I right about that? A PhD. Yes. So that's the correction. But so the joy of doctoral studenthood awaits you. It's one of those things, perhaps like a pregnancy, that you can dread and cherish at the same time if you ever do it. Anyway, it's also great to have Brian and Danielle with us, not just because of their expertise and experience and brilliance, but also because they, during the Trump era, showed us how people could disagree and agree collegially, respectfully, and find a lot of common grounds on different sides of the equation. So thank you to both for that. I don't think I've ever had a chance to thank you at the same time for that work during a very painful period in our history that may or may not be over. So what I'm going to do here is give my overview briefly of what I think is going on. And that hopefully will be some kind of a framework for our conversation. And then I'll get everybody's reaction to what I've said, see what I've missed, where I'm wrong, etc. And from then on, it will be the panel. And I'll try to moderate the conversation to give it shape. At a certain point, I'll turn to your questions in the Q&A and curate them and bring them in. So here's the way I look at what's happening with this trip. I think there's a big picture view and a granular view, and they're both very instructive. The big picture view, in my opinion, is that Biden surprised everybody in the presidency, generally speaking, by being a very ambitious guy. He came in talking about, a New Deal and Roosevelt and all this stuff. And he did a lot in his first year. 1.9 trillion in COVID relief, that's no joke, right? Got forgotten, but that's a big, big get. And the hard infrastructure bill was another big get, but he ran aground horribly on the big win for the liberals and the Democrats, which was the Build Back Better program, which just got completely stymied in the Senate. And obviously, the domestic agenda simply ground to a halt in terms of legislation. And there didn't seem to be a way forward, particularly since the midterms don't look very good, even in the Senate. It's hard to say, but, he was sort of stuck. And then comes the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And suddenly, a new international opportunity to go big emerges unexpectedly, because Europeans are confronted with by far the biggest aggression since the 1930s, since World War II and the lead up to World War II. And he attempted, I think very skillfully, to rally the Western alliance and recreate the Western alliance around NATO and the EU and expand NATO even to include Finland and Sweden. So a remarkable historic transformation, if it holds, that's a big if. Look at the French and the Germans, and you can see a lot of weaknesses for sure. But right now, it is holding for the meanwhile. You can make a lot of criticisms of it, but it's worked remarkably well, in my view. And I think they think it's worked very well. Turning to the Middle East, I think this trip has turned into an effort to explore what might be possible in that region that's an analog. Less ambitious, less dramatic, but you've got the same problem fundamentally in the immediate sense, which is a regional hegemon. In Eastern Europe, it's Russia. In the Middle East, it's Iran. And the Vienna talks, I think we have to say, have failed or are on the brink of failing. I think they failed. We'll see. I could be surprised. That would be good. It's clearly an Iranian decision at this point, 100%. They've got compliance for compliance on the table. They're not taking it. They want some win on the IRGC. It's a completely it's utterly hypocritical and has nothing to do with compliance for compliance, but they've decided to, die on that hill. Fine. Biden's not going to give it to them, clearly, unless they give him something he can take back, that's significant. He's not going to give them that. And that's quite right. Absolutely correct, right? So he's got to deal then with a new agenda of containment and deterrence against Iran. There's no alternative. I mean, you could leave the Gulf altogether, or you could side with these radical regime in Iran, or you could double down with your friends in the region and create an alternative. And my point about Vienna is it doesn't matter if they've given up on the talks or they think they need more leverage to get the talks over the final hump. It would look the same. You would still have to begin constructing that regime of containment and deterrence. So I think that's the immediate goal, to see what's possible in doing that, in bringing local partners together. The second thing, of course, is the long-term rise of China. This is very important. We'll get to it, but that's a longer-term goal for this coalition, to wean Israel and especially Gulf countries away from their flirtation with China, not just Russia, which looks less attractive than it did so obviously in both morally and in terms of capabilities. But China is still, my answer to that would be get back to me in 2060. But there is this chimera of the Chinese alternative, the Chinese what have you. And sure, if the United States did fade away, that would happen more quickly. So I think at the big picture, there's an effort to create a new American bloc in the region with an eye to Iran and with a long-term eye to China. Now, when you look more granularly at the schedule, you see the logic, in graphically. It's almost like a rhizome, right? It's symbols that turn into an equation, which turns into a sentence. All right. You start in Jerusalem. You talk to the Israelis. Why? Because ultimately, if you're going to bring the Saudis into this in an overt way, you need to move the needle on the Palestinians somehow or the other. I don't know what the Saudi price on Palestine is, but the Saudis have regional Arab leadership role that they have to be aware of. They have a global Islamic leadership role that they really cherish, and brittle domestic politics that don't exist in the UAE and Bahrain. So they have to be very careful. So I think they have to move the needle. You go to Bethlehem to talk to Abu Mazen, take his pulse, literally and figuratively, and see what might be possible. Then you go on the 5th, so that's the 14th in Jerusalem. The 13th in Jerusalem, the 14th in Bethlehem. The 15th, meeting with the king and, yes, indeed, the crown prince, whatever he says, that's going to happen. And then on the 16th, the kicker. It's the GCC plus summit. And this is the crucial thing. If it was just the GCC, it wouldn't be this interesting. But it's the GCC plus Jordan, the governments of Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq. That means all friendly governments are part of this trip. And you get this sort of addition, right? You begin with the Israelis, you try to add the Palestinians, the PLO and the PA, then you add the Saudis, and then you bring in everybody else who might be friendly in the region. And if you can come up with something after the equals sign, potentially, you go forward. This is how I see the trip. I've spoken enough. I'm going to ask Mohammed what he thinks, and then we'll go to Danielle and then Brian.
Thank you, Hussein. There's nothing to correct, I think. Yeah, I mean, I prepared some points. I won't speak to all of them, but what I wanted to touch on was sort of the discourse on the U.S. Saudi relationship that we've seen in Washington, both in academic circles and policy circles over the past 10 years, not just in the past 4 or indeed 8. In people's analysis of the U.S.-Saudi relationship, the kingdom is often portrayed as a little more than just an ATM machine or a gas station. It's viewed purely through the lens of energy economics and oil. And I think that analysis is dangerous and it's wrong. And it's also very novel in the United States. There's never been a time where that type of analysis was not present, but there used to be deeper analysis of the value that the U.S.-Saudi relationship brought. Now, granted,
do you see anything in the Biden agenda that goes beyond that? I'm sorry to interrupt, but do you see anything in this trip that challenges?
I think that's changing right now. I think there is frustration with this idea of realigning towards Iran. The Iranians are not playing ball. They're causing a lot of mischief in the region, and this very new Obama doctrine idea of having a region that's shared between Saudi Arabia and Iran is an idea that is really being called into question by even some of the people that were the biggest proponents of that idea. And this is in part understandable. I mean, the collapse of the Soviet Union is now over 30 years ago. That's when the U.S.-Saudi alliance reached its strategic peak, where energy intersected with military operations, with media operations. I mean, the Saudi government at that point in time was funding a lot of media in Italy, for example, that would act as a bulwark against Soviet propaganda. So the cooperation was not just the cooperation of a country that's an ATM machine or a gas station. It was a deeply strategic cooperation. And what we see today, I think, and this is the crux of why this visit is important, I think, is that Saudi Arabia has a model for its own country. It's undergoing a very massive transformation, one that is predicated on a social transformation, but also on economic diversification, and of course, it's doing this out of a commitment to its own self-interest. But we mustn't forget that that self-interested project that it's undergoing is also squarely within the self-interest of the United States, and also it's valuable as a model for other countries in the region. And then this is a model that embraces the aspirations of young people, that says youth bulges are not threats to be quashed, but opportunities to be embraced. And I think that's the main difference, and that's the main difference between the way Iran is operating and the way Saudi Arabia is operating. And I truly think that this is deeply misunderstood in certain circles in the United States. There is still an idea that the public in Middle Eastern countries is deeply anti-American and deeply anti-imperialist. In the 80s and the 90s, that might have been true, but today there is a massive youth bulge in the region. And in Iran, the government in that country uses backwards reactionary, violent Islamism to crush the aspirations of young people. In Saudi Arabia, we see the exact opposite. We see a government that's drawing on the energy of young people to push back against a dangerous Islamist countercurrent that has taken the country hostage for many decades, and certainly throughout the 80s and the 90s after the return of the Mujahideen from Afghanistan. So it really is a very important moment, and the region is at a very important crossroads. So and understanding that, I think, is important.
You see a real opportunity here. Danielle, what do you think of all of that? Respond to either of us, please.
I'll respond to everybody. Thank you for having me, first of all, and for the lovely introduction. It's really...
I apologize for the Jerry Garcia beard here.
You warned us, and I think it looks very distinguished, if a little bit Unabomber-ish. So sort of a balance. look, am I optimistic that this is an inflection point? I fall somewhere between the two of you. I think while I think that the youth bulge. God, how many years are we going to talk about the youth bulge? But I do think that it is a mixed bag in terms of the prospects for the region. On the one hand, you can see. I think the intelligence and the shrewdness of Mohammed bin Salman's desire to not only exploit this huge young population in Saudi Arabia, but also to take it beyond where it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I agree that young people have very much moved beyond that sort of reflexive anti-Americanism, what they may think of as anti-imperialism. Not everyone, but certainly some. But no matter what, when you are offering a better economic future, more economic opportunity, more freedom, and that in all of its iterations, and don't forget, we're not just talking about men here, especially in Saudi Arabia, we're talking about freedom for women. That is, one, a sharp contrast with what you're seeing in Iran, but also, I think, a net positive. So those are very good things. Of course, the inherent problem with all of this for the future is that you need to actually employ these people. And Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that it loves to say it's not a gas station, has really been, has had so many iterations of its Vision 2030 over the years. And unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember all of them, and has not been, let's say, brilliant on execution. One hopes that there will be a difference now, because in fact, the country does need to actually sustain that hope. You don't want to end up like, let's say China. You do not want to end up with a country that has a massive market explosion that offers a rising tide to all boats, and then suddenly see it sinking. That causes a lot of disgruntlement with government. So, there are inherent risks in that, and obviously we don't need to talk about the risks that we see from Iran.
But can you link all of this really interesting and I think perceptive stuff to the specific visit?
Right, that's where I'm going here.
Yeah,
and so I think that where I see the problems, other than the honestly, reasonably obvious analytical problems that you see in each of these countries. Where you see, I think, the real problems are in Washington. We can say to ourselves that the Biden administration has woken up and smelled the coffee, recognized that the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, while certainly unacceptable, perhaps shouldn't be central to every single piece of our foreign policy making towards the Gulf. That's really all they've recognized. I think that as a matter of worldview, from this administration, particularly from the only part of this administration that matters, which is in the White House, that everything remains the same. In other words, that they look at the last 70 years and they say the United States got absolutely nowhere by viewing the Middle East through the prism of Sunni Islam, through our interlocutors in Cairo or in Riyadh, or elsewhere. And we should now work through the Iranian angle. Yes, the talks are failing, but I think that should the Iranians turn around, this administration would, in a heartbeat, be back there.
Of course.
And to think that this may have failed because the Iranians want it to fail, but it certainly hasn't failed because the White House wants it to fail. This visit, I hate to say, Mohammed, here I disagree with you, or perhaps I'm overinterpreting what you said. I think this is completely a gas station visit. I think this is completely about domestic economic prices. I think this is completely about a recognition of reality, right? That we actually still depend on Saudi Arabia.
Let me ask you a question, though. So okay, if Ukraine hadn't happened, I would not disagree with you at all. I would say, gas station visit, rising oil prices, international opportunity where domestic has failed. Okay, but Ukraine happened. I'm not saying that this is the big vision that I outlined is going to work at all, or that there's even an opportunity. But don't you think they're actually looking into that? I mean, this is what they're exploring, or am I imagining something that is complete chimera.
You're imagining something, and perhaps I'm ungenerous. On the other hand, like all of you, I know these guys pretty well.
Yeah.
So, I guess here's the analytical problem from my perspective, Hussein, and this is something that we're actually arguing about even internally at AEI. The economic problems that the United States are facing have very little to do with Ukraine. Okay. They have a lot to do with a lot of different things, but part of it is pouring trillions of dollars into the economy that was already flush with cash post-COVID, because none of us spent any money except me. I spent a ton of money. I don't know how I did it, but in any case, but this is really the problem. If you want to put it all on Ukraine, that would suggest that we return to a status quo ante once the question of Ukraine is resolved, and that's just not true. I think Ukraine exacerbated. I don't think that it changed minds.
So that I don't actually agree with that, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole because we need to bring Brian in.
Can I make a quick comment?
Extremely patient. A quick comment from Mohammed. Brief one, because Brian has been patient.
Yeah, no, I think Danielle made a very good point. And she used a very suitable phrase, which is this visit is a recognition of reality.
Yeah.
If you remember, in March 2022, the United States imported more Russian oil than any other month on record, right?
Right.
And the U.S. isn't to blame for that, because we all live in the physical world. The Chinese live in the physical world. The Americans live in the physical world, and so do the Saudis. And there are cars that need gas and houses that need heating.
Companies are buying Russian oil to sell to China. I mean, this is the world.
But the reality is, at the same time as the United States was reprimanding its allies for allegedly not doing enough to counter Vladimir Putin, the United States was buying more Russian oil than it's ever bought in its history. And again, it did that because physical reality is physical, it's tangible. You have to touch it. It's not something you can run away from.
Yeah.
So to Danny's point, I think, recognition of reality is in part that energy markets are important, and that, creating an energy policy that overlooks these physical realities and forces someone to go and buy Russian oil is not the best way to create policy. Okay. But the other points that I mentioned are also physical realities that I think are being appreciated. Are they being appreciated as much as they should be? I don't know.
So we have here now a division between a more panoramic view and a more granular view. Brian, tie it together. Do it.
So I
Bring
think
us home.
3 weeks is a lot of time, and we have 3 weeks before this visit, and a lot could happen. And my sense is that there's a lot of work that both, if we're just talking U.S. Saudi, the bilateral, there's a lot of work the teams need to do to actually clarify it. What I'm hearing, if you look carefully at the various statements and things that were issued in the last week or so, since the visit was announced, is a potential mismatch of expectations between the United States and Saudi Arabia. And I'll just briefly sort of break down what I think is opportunities and then some of the challenges. The headline, though, for me is better late than never on this visit. If you remember, President Biden came into office and pretty early on said he was going to recalibrate the relationship. And more or less, if you look under the hood of what happened, not much happened in the first year. I think if you carefully look at what happened on the bilateral, there wasn't a recalibration. So this is a recalibrate the recalibration, if you will. And I think the opportunity here is to try to, for the United States, not just oil and energy, obviously that's a top line, but I do think there's a broader opportunity in the regional security environment. Clearly, there's no plan B on Iran. Plan A is not working out. Clearly, also, the plan A on Yemen didn't work out the way that the Biden team had hoped. And here we are a year plus later, and there is a tenuous truce there. So I think the opportunities are multiple, but the broader sort of opportunity is to actually try to put the bilateral relationship on a much more stable foundation. To use the term the Saudis use for their own policies, Vision 2030, we actually need to get out of sort of the polemical, partisan debates here in this country and figure out where can the two countries work together. I think there's a lot of opportunity outside of oil and the economy there's the regional security environment, and then there's this issue of ideology, which it's something that's changed quite a lot within the kingdom compared to, say, 5 or 10 years ago. But the challenges are many. First, on that mismatch of expectations, note that President Biden has been shying away from talking about what many expect is the bilateral meeting he'll have with MBS because of the controversy, because of the really hard feelings about the murder of Khashoggi and the human rights abuses. And I hope that those issues, and especially the human rights issues, stay on the agenda. That's what mature powers do, is agree to disagree on that. Another,
you can't drop the human rights questions.
And be serious about it, not just note it. Right. But then I've never understood sort of the theory of the case that somehow we would get better human rights performance out of countries like Saudi Arabia by simply downgrading ties. I'm a true believer in diplomacy and engagement, including with countries like Iran and tough countries. That's where some of our best diplomats have had their biggest successes with the Soviet Union. So there's another challenge is what I think is a deep insecurity among the Saudi leadership itself. Quite clearly, if you look at the Graham Wood article, the interview he did with MBS last fall that was published this spring, uneasy lies the head that almost wears the crown, right? And there's a trust and confidence gap in the bilateral, but there's also, I think, inherent in most absolute monarchies, there's this concern about legitimacy, which is what they're looking for. And then I'll close here on another challenge, which struck me from a visit I took last month to the kingdom, and it really sort of surprised me, but I guess it shouldn't have, is that on the issue of the Ukraine war and the positioning on Russia, I think the top line of most analysts here in Washington is that, they're just hedging. This is not 1991. It's the U.S. has not just won the Cold War and a war in the Middle East. I came away from that visit feeling a lot of what you hear on RT Arabic and a lot of what you hear in terms of ideology from Russia, its own worldview. It actually has seeped into Saudi strategic thinking in some sense. It's deeper than hedging. I worry that a lot of the key points that were made about U.S. sanctions, for instance, on Russia, it's a much more complicated picture. So if this is a recalibrate the recalibration, that sort of broader geopolitical environment, and I'll add to it China, further complicates this. And I know you want to take us there, Hussein, but the fact that last month, Russia overtook Saudi Arabia as China's sort of leading source of energy, as I understand from recent headlines. This is a very complicated geopolitical moment to try to execute the recalibration. And then lastly, back here in the domestic, and I'll close with this, is that it's rare to find a moment when a U.S. president who has such low approval ratings and is not performing as much as he'd like in the domestic scene, it's rare that they go to the Middle East. So I think it's a bold move. I actually think it's warranted. But my main point is that 3 weeks is a lot of time. I don't think that they've clearly defined the terms of what they want as outcomes. And then importantly, the meetings between leaders needs to set sort of a dialogue for a broader sort of recalibration of that relationship that involves the Saudis.
There's a tension between understating expectations by Biden and overstating implicitly by some of the, slightly under Biden. If you were asked by Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, what would be the big ask beyond energy? What would be the message? What would be the most important thing to get through to the Saudi leadership and others in the region?
I think beyond the energy and economics, I would say the regional security environment is terribly fragile. So to take steps that actually, even in small ways, enhance that. And I think when you see the talk, at least, of a regional security cooperation that involves air defenses and things like this, because I think that is a positive thing if it's walked forward. And we shouldn't get so bullish about Arab NATO or even the GCC plus meeting and that having involved Israel. I've written about this quite a lot, Hussein, the lack of trust and confidence between some of the key parties, even within the GCC, though the blockade is over, there's still that lack of trust. So the key thing I would stress is take actions that strengthen the state system, take actions that actually increase opportunity for the broader region, because the region itself is buffeted by these high energy prices and then food prices. So it's not just Saudi Arabia, please be our ATM. Saudi Arabia, please actually help not only your own situation improve, which I think they're taking steps, their internal situation, but help the broader region become more stable.
Context, right?
Yeah, because the Yemen war quite clearly did not succeed in doing that, though they're in a truce moment right now. So that's the opportunity, I think. And I would add to that, Hussein, and again, I wouldn't get out of our skis because we know what Iran is looking like right now. But the fact that Saudi Arabia, other countries are talking with Iran, I think that's, again, a very modest tactical opportunity, not likely to yield success, but we want to encourage those sorts of dialogues through diplomacy.
Yeah, you have to bring them in. Danielle, you clearly want to say something about that. You don't? Okay, sorry. Well then.
No, I clearly don't. I was actually
fine. I was
just listening and admiring everybody's.
I misinterpreted a deep breath as reflecting an interior thought. Mohammed, the question Biden will face in Congress, the immediate political pushback, has to do with the lingering memories of the murder of Jamal and other human rights concerns that are not addressed. Obviously, nothing practical can be done on the Khashoggi issue that hasn't been done, in my view, and he certainly cannot be, brought back to life. So, are there ways of addressing these legitimate concerns in Congress about some of the, ongoing human rights issues, concerns that people legitimately would like to see some improvement on, beyond the really stunning socio-cultural and even in a way economic liberalization that needs more attention? Here's what I guess I want to rephrase a little bit. It seems to me that the Saudi Arabia, the whole country of Saudi Arabia, won't get the credit it deserves for the amazing transformation that has been going on, as long as there are these high-profile cases that are, in my view, unnecessary and that could be addressed. Maybe not even all of them, some of them, that are of concern to Congress, that show progress in a way that is receivable on Capitol Hill. Do you understand what and so that people can get the blinders off and see the transformation for what it is. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I get it. I mean, I think it's worth noting that this transformation that Saudi Arabia is undergoing is being done for its own national interests to improve Saudi Arabia. It's not being done in order to gain favor or curry favor with Congress or the Senate or Europe or whoever else. It's being done because it's something that's in Saudi Arabia's national interest. That said, there's also difficulties for Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's many things that the United States does that do not fall within the value system of Saudi Arabia. For example, take trans surgeries on minors. That's considered by the vast majority of Saudis to be a grave affront on human rights. But there's no lectures coming from Saudi Arabia on that.
No. We're not talking about cultural norms. No, Mohammed. Let me stop you. We're not. No.
Whether it's a cultural norm. I mean, this is
talking about people in prison. Who probably for an American
Saudi Arabia,
really should not be.
That's not something to be swept away as a cultural norm. That's the point.
Fair enough.
But it's something that happens inside in the United States. And Saudi Arabia doesn't feel that it's in a position to start dictating to the United States what it should do with its own minors or what it should do in its own society. That's an internal matter inside Saudi Arabia. Now, that being said, Saudi Arabia's transformation is occurring on many different fronts, and it's occurring at a different pace and intensity on many of these fronts. There is a legal and procedural transformation happening. It's happening at a pace that might be a bit slower than the economic transformation is taking place at. But again, the point I'm trying to make is the murder of Jamal Khashoggi was awful, and the outrage to a large degree was justified precisely because Saudi Arabia is not a country known for things like this. If it was Syria, if something like this happened in Syria or Iran, it would be in the news for 2 weeks because that's their modus operandi. In Saudi Arabia, this is something that is not normal. It does not happen every day. But it's also worth noting that there is also fatigue in Saudi Arabia about what people think. And there's another point I would like to make, which is, young people in Saudi Arabia, hundreds of thousands of them went to school in the United States and in Europe. And I see this among very many young people in Saudi Arabia. They romanticize China, right? They think China is the answer to all of their problems. And it's naive. China is not the answer to all of their problems. China cannot replace the United States. If they went to China, they change their minds in an instant. But that's a result of what many people describe as this Washington Post foreign policy, where Saudi Arabia is berated on a daily basis when musicians and artists that are the favorites of young Saudi girls who bought tickets to go to these events are shamed and named in the pages of various newspapers in the United States for performing for young Saudis. So it's no longer just one or two human rights issues that are the issue. It's just an assault, an unrelenting assault on the entire country.
So I think we're talking at different registers because they're both issues in different ways. But I agree with you entirely. But I still think that there are some outstanding cases that stick in the craw of me and of people in Congress. But it doesn't matter. The question that I'm getting from the Q&A, and by the way, if you have questions for our panelists, please go ahead. If they could become useful, I'll bring them in. This is a very useful one from Chris Hensel. What would the Saudis really want from this visit? Within the realm of reason, within the realm of what Brian is saying, it's 3 weeks is a long time. It's also short, right? And there's a lot of distance to be covered. There are many issues to be dealt with. What would I asked Brian? What would the intention be from Saudi Arabia's point of view? What do you think the biggest hope would be for this? Within reason.
I think they're looking for a sense of legitimacy for.
I want you to finish, but I was actually asking Mohammed, but I want you to finish your thought, Brian, because I think you're very well placed to address it. So please go ahead, and then I want Mohammed's view.
I'm really sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
I misunderstood your cue.
No, I know. I was sort of wanting him to do what you had done for the administration, but I want you to say this because you've been there many times, so finish. Please go right ahead.
Yeah, I think it's just the sense that they're in a different place in the world right now, not just their leader, but as a country. And the thing that has struck me is that, yes, there are still extreme challenges with how the United States deals with Saudi Arabia for reasons that I think relate to our values and who we are. My main point is that engaging that and opening up conversations is likely to lead to, if not better understanding, at least some hope for progress. Isolating it, I'd love to hear the pathway of, then what's next? But I think the trip
itself is progress, surely. I mean, the trip itself, by definition, is progress.
Right. So I think the Saudis are looking for that sense of legitimacy, not only for their leaders, but then also their role in the G20 and the global economy. So
recognition of legitimacy domestically and as a regional leader. Good. Mohammed, what do you think?
I guess I would agree with many of the points that Brian made. But also, the Saudis, and indeed not just only the Saudis, but probably other actors in the region, including the GCC and maybe even the Israelis, are just trying to figure out where the U.S. stands from its own regional security architecture, right? Does it want to maintain it? Does it want to withdraw? Is it pivoting to China? Is it not pivoting to China? Would it get very upset if people talk to China? What about Russia? People in the region aren't oblivious to the fact that Vladimir Putin has a foothold in the Eastern Mediterranean as a result of the Obama administration policy, right? Yeah. So there is confusion as to what really the United States wants. And sometimes, there's a view in the region that the United States sometimes doesn't know what it wants. These countries, these allies of the United States for a while, for a long time, have acted as pillars for its regional security structure. So now they're wondering, is this structure being dismantled? It's not about judgment, it's not about recrimination, but it's just about confusion. Yeah. What role are we playing right now?
That's a good question. So what they would want is clarity. I would love that too, because not only do we lack a consensus domestically, the Biden administration has been particular. Brian wrote a great piece about this, that what day of the week is it? Depends on, how they define their major foreign policy ask. I think it was excellent. And I actually think that's a problem tooth court for the administration on almost all their policies, including really good ones, that the messaging just, forgive me, sucks and doesn't trust people with the blunt choices that are being made on inflation. With the spending that Danielle referred to. Okay, they could have explained it, but they didn't. Danielle, address everything you've heard, and then I have another question for you.
Okay, well, I actually wanted to raise something that we're not talking about, which may be a transition for you.
I might put something to you first, but raise it, and then, yeah.
Okay, you interrupt me if you need to.
Yeah.
Look, I do think that part of the conversation that the administration has already signaled is that they are looking to advance somehow the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel. That shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, and they want their piece of the Abraham Accords. Why should Donald Trump get all of it? The complicating factor here is not, as one might suspect, I think, the collapse of the Israeli government, although, we got so used to the collapse of the Israeli government, but then we came away from it, and now we're getting used to it again. But I think the much more complicating factor is the directionless problem of the Palestinian leadership. So, if they want, look, this is, as you know, my perspective on this. The problem is that if the Saudis are looking for some sort of progress, some sort of signal, something they can balance against an improved or changed relationship with Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians, they're going to have a slight problem. Okay. Of course, we've got the Hamas problem in Gaza, but even setting that aside, we've got the serious Abu Mazen problem, right? He's ancient and getting ancienter. He's dictatorial and getting more dictatorial. He's not delivered, and he's so focused on squashing any question of succession that for us, the only things we can do are just punch the same old buttons. Oh, we'll give them more money, better peace talks. Maybe we'll have a fake embassy for the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. We'll name somebody you like. You can put lipstick on that pig, which is not kosher or halal, but you can put lipstick on it. But at the end of the day, it's going to be pretty fake. And that is, and worse yet, I think it's going to be obviously fake, and I think the challenge.
Here's the question, though. I mean, I really don't disagree with much of what you said, other than I quite like pork, but anyway, I mean, hamon iberico, But anyway, look, there's nothing to work with on the Israeli side either. What could the Israeli body politic deliver, even in a minor way, other than like not expanding certain key settlements? But what could they give? What could they really loosen in terms of the occupation? Not much, right?
I agree. I agree.
Right. So you've got nothing. This is the same problem we've had since the first Obama term fiasco over the settlement freeze, which was the last nail in the coffin of the Oslo process, as I'm concerned. There's nothing you can get out of the Israeli body politic. There's nothing you can get out of Abu Mazen and the PA that's useful at the moment, at the PLO. Hamas is not part of the equation, should not be part of the equation, obviously, for obvious reasons, right? So how do you move the needle there? If you can't, the question then becomes, do the Israelis see a pathway? Do the American friends of Israel see a pathway to something more coherent without being able to move that needle? I'd be surprised if it were serious, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure there isn't.
I mean, look, the way I would answer that is, I hate to say this, a little bit, certainly from the perspective of the Gulf, is that, this is a problem that has diminished in importance. And, we can all pay lip service to it, and we all want to see a peace, and we all want to see, various aspects of it. And we all probably know pretty much what it looks like. But the reality is that the Saudis are sitting next to the Iranians. As Mohammed said correctly, the Iranians are not simply causing all sorts of mischief, but are really actually consolidating their mischief. Where they had been in trouble, let's say in Syria, I think things have largely settled down. They've really, stomped their jackbooted heel on the throat of the Iraqis. And so, yes, of course, there's a Yemen problem as well. But I mean, it's Iran. So
it goes without saying.
And then Palestine.
Yeah. Right. So even more. No, I don't think you then go to Palestine. I think you then go to the Muslim Brotherhood of Turkey.
I was being nice.
Look, there's no doubt in the 20 years, precisely 20 years between the high point of Oslo negotiations was also the low point, which was Camp David in 2000. 20 years later, almost to the day, come the Abraham Accord. And in that 20 years, the entire equation changed in ways that go beyond Iran. So you're right, the Palestine issue has diminished. It hasn't become number two. It's not even, is it number three? But it hasn't gone away. So I want to ask Mohammed, what you think the prospects are without moving the needle at all on the Palestinian issue, the occupation, for Israeli-Saudi relations that go beyond, the tacit, the covert, the, cooperation behind the scenes that we've seen, and little steps with visas and meetings in Jordan and Gaza, please.
Yeah, I think the studies have been very clear. The value of having an overt relationship while ignoring the Palestinian issue is not something that they put a lot of trust in. They're adamant on moving the needle, as you said, on the Palestinian issue, on recognition of a Palestinian state, on getting a process going, and under that umbrella, exploring ways to cooperate with Israel and recognizing Israel. And the Saudi officials, including Prince Mohammed bin Salman, have repeatedly commented on how a relationship with Israel and overt peace can be very beneficial to both countries. But again, the Palestinian issue is an important one. But you mentioned the point about the Palestinian cause not being as powerful of an influence on people in the region. I still think it is, right?
I don't think that's what was said. No. Let's be clear. What was said was or at least what I think makes sense that was said, was the kind of urgent crisis posed by the Palestinian issue has diminished. The impact on the people, the public sentiment is a different story. Now talk about public sentiment.
So the public sentiment has changed, but I don't think it's changed in such a way where people don't care about Palestine anymore, or people don't hold Israel to account for crimes it commits. That's not the way it changed. I think the way it changed, and I think the Abraham Accords contributed to some degree to this, is that commitment to the Palestinian cause and sympathy with the Palestinian cause is no longer required to be part of a package where you have to also support Hezbollah and Hamas and the Iranian Revolution and all of these anti-imperialist revolutionary forces across the region.
And you could be critical of the PLO, you could be critical of Abu Mazen.
Precisely.
So you don't, it's not fealty.
In the past, on a large scale in societies across the Arab world, I think, and I hate to generalize, but criticizing Hezbollah or Hamas or the Syrian Ba'ath or the Iraqi Ba'ath or the Iranian regime or Abu Mazen is considered, treacherous or a betrayal of the Palestinian cause. Today, that is no longer the case whatsoever. People look at the Palestinian cause, they realize that the backwardsness that's seen in many countries across the Middle East is because of the exploitation and utilization of the Palestinian cause in order for these military strongmen.
So the regional sumud thing has not been helpful to anybody, including the Palestinians. Right? Agreed. Okay. So I think we should also acknowledge that that poor Jamal was not the only journalist who was killed by one of the governments that the president's going to see. Shireen Abu Akleh was clearly murdered, assassinated. Whether it was ordered from the top or not, I'm not sure we ever know. I am sure she was personally targeted. And again, it's not going to be an issue. Danielle doesn't think so. I think it's obvious. Doesn't matter. That's my view. And I think that's the view of most people who've paid close attention to it. The point is, the president is going into a situation where statecraft trumps these concerns a lot in a way that we have to deal with, and it's not the only case. So, Brian, you've been very patient. Go right ahead. And Danielle, if you want to respond to that in a minute, that's fine. But go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say on the Israeli-Palestinian front, maybe draw it to the bigger picture. What I heard on this recent visit to Riyadh, when I asked very directly, is that it's clear it's not a priority. I think there's a lot of high hopes and expectations from some in Israel and some in the pro-Israel community in the United States about some possibility of a breakthrough. And if you read, for instance, the White House's readout of this visit last week, there was a lot of talk of that and an emphasis on the fact that the president will be flying from Israel to Jeddah directly, which is not a new thing. Donald Trump sort of did it in reverse in 2017. I just don't think the math equation adds up. What I heard from Saudi leaders is that they recognize that there is a aging leadership in the Palestinian Authority. They recognized that years ago, they used to just listen way too much to the PLO and PA leadership, that there's a new generation that's going to emerge, but they themselves quite likely don't have the ability to shape that right now, and that they need to study up a bit. This is Saudi speaking about Palestinians as a factor, and Jerusalem is a factor, but that there's not much that could be done right now. I also think that the notion that they might, the Saudis, announce some sort of Abraham Accords at this point seems so far-fetched.
No, that's not
what I would, what I just draw it back to U.S. policy, which is what I focus on, is if you look at the Biden administration, it was so clear that the broad Middle East in its first year and a half was maybe made the top 10 of the foreign policy issues. Maybe. And the Gaza war last year was Biden's Michael Corleone moment. Just when I thought I was out of the Middle East, I was pulled back in, but only tactically. I think it would do them well to not only talk about these regional security dynamics at the GCC Plus meeting, but also try to think of ways to make sure that countries like Jordan, which has a key equity with the Palestinians, and they'll be at this meeting, is to, okay, if we can't solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue, what could we do to at least make things not worse and perhaps even slightly better for the Palestinian people? And again, I'm not just talking about go for the bare minimum of some sort of right-wing sort of notion of economic peace. What I'm talking about is what could be done in this broader global context of high energy and food prices, and people actually, not only Palestinians, but Egyptians and others, being hit by this. So we're looking at conditions in the Middle East right now that look quite similar to what you saw in 2010, early 2011, socially and economically. For the have-nots I'm talking about. And the Palestinians are part of that have-nots. And it's easy for all of us to try to ignore that and say, well, this situation is stuck. Yes, the political situation is stuck. But on the ground, it may not be the case for the people.
There's a lot of work to be done on the ground. I'm really glad you mentioned Jordan, because Jordan had a very rough ride during the Trump era, not necessarily because of Trump, but that those years were unkind to the Jordanian government. I posit it's still the case that all the positive forces in the region need Jordan to be Jordan and do what Jordan does. And there's a lot of strengthening that can be done, not necessarily in this visit, but by the regional powers of the United States. But I wanted to bring in a question and bring Danielle back into the conversation about time. And bring in one of the questions from Chris Williams again. Very good question. Anyone can ask a question via Q&A. Any speculation about big announcements on cooperation, energy, nuclear? This again, space. But I want to throw one in also, which is the rumored but still not confirmed and speculated about for years, really, mutual defense agreement between the United States and the UAE, which some people say is on the brink of completion and other people say absolutely not. What about big announcements either in this visit or in the near future? What do you think, Danielle? Or anything else you want to talk about? But that's where I'd like to go. I'd like to go with the
big
flashy neon stuff. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think of this group, I suspect that I'm the least close to this administration. But that being said, I am in touch with reality, as Mohammed noted very nicely before. And I don't see the nuclear agreement, I don't think is going anywhere. Very simple, even if the administration wanted to, and I would say there's not a chance the administration wanted to, even if they wanted to, Congress isn't there. There's a lot that remains to be worked out in terms of holding Saudi Arabia to a different standard, violating the standard that we held the UAE to, and all of that. And
there's time, right? There's time. There's no urgency on that one.
I don't think so. And if I've got to say, if I'm sitting in Riyadh, it's not what I'm putting as my number one. I think you could see some. I think you could see some tourism things. I think that's easy. But I also don't think that it rises to the neon level of excitement. In terms of defense agreements with the United Arab Emirates, ditto. one of the earlier decisions that the Biden administration made was to just sort of, shrug off in a kind of low profile way Iranian drone attacks or Iranian sourced or promoted drone attacks on civilian targets in the UAE. While I think the administration can say, that will never happen again and we won't do that, I think it's very unlikely that they're looking for more entanglement in the region. You
don't believe the numerous reports that McGurk delivered a draft mutual defense agreement in late May? You think that's exaggerated, hyperbolic, spin nonsense, or just skeptical?
Count me skeptical. Count me skeptical that something that would be satisfactory to both sides would. Now, again, I don't want to cast aspersions on Brett, or at least more aspersions on Brett than other people choose to. But
it's not about personalities.
Well, but it is a little bit here, and that's part of the problem. Is I think the administration also has the same problem that plagued previous administrations, which is a lot of cooks in that kitchen that have
that's
differing ideas.
Yeah. If I could, beyond the personality, what I do know that there have been ongoing discussions to try to get to some sort of bilateral security agreement. And I actually think if that's heavily often politicized, right, because of the objections over the Yemen war and arms sales and how different advocacy groups try to use security cooperation in our own debate here at home.
Well, and China.
I was going to add those two dimensions. One is the China dimension, which U.S. policymakers, there are lots of similarities actually on the Middle East between Trump and Biden. I wouldn't overstate it, but one is this deep concern about some of our close partners in the Middle East, including the UAE and Israel, and how they've related to China on the technology issue. So that's one. The second is the more we go deeper into bilateral security cooperation agreements, it cuts against the grain of a broader effort, which I've called for, which is better regional security integration. Not necessarily so, but if you're deepening your ties on a bilateral in a hub and spoke sense, it does challenge the notion of trying to get to more interoperable systems, which again, simply just helping countries defend themselves. Because
you mean because it incentivizes focus on bilateral rather than regional?
Yeah, it makes it a little bit, and each of these countries still love to have their exclusive relationship with each administration that comes in. And to me, the wave of the future would be for the U.S. to stay engaged in Middle East regional security, but to move away from this role of being the guarantor in a bilateral hub and spoke model, and one that we can evolve. And this will take years, given what I said earlier about lack of trust and confidence, but one in which we're evolving and helping the region sort of stitch up its capabilities. And again, I would focus on also the defensive aspects of this, given the threat environment from terrorist
missile
groups.
Defense, early warning.
Not offensive, because back here, what gets politicized is, well, you're going to just help start another endless war. No, you're actually trying to help countries defend themselves from a daily onslaught of cyber and drone attacks and other things, which is a real factor that we often ignore over here.
Well, I wanted to ask Mohammed, he's off camera, but I assume he's online, to join and address this question of bilateral versus regional, multilateral, from a Saudi perspective, Gulf perspective in general. Is there any contradiction from your point of view? How do you view this?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, Brian was suggesting that increased bilateral agreements, so mutual defense agreements and things like that, may disincentivize regional interoperability and regional coordination under U.S. umbrella or in cooperation with the United States. And so the question I'm asking you is, from a Saudi and Gulf perspective, is there a tension here? And what would be the preference? Would a bilateral improvement take precedence over regional? And how do you parse it a bit? It's a really interesting conundrum. I think it is a conundrum. I agree with that. I don't think it's.
I don't think they're mutually exclusive, right? You can have bilateral security agreements and a multilateral regional security agreement, and one doesn't have to infringe on the other. I mean, the default is a bilateral one. That's what existed for the past 80 years. I don't think it's viewed as something that would risk disintegrating an existing bilateral relationship. Now, the bilateral relationship has suffered a little bit more in the past 10 years than it has perhaps at any other point in its history. And that's something that needs to be dealt with irrespective of whether, a meaningful regional coalition or security umbrella is successful.
All right, so I want to look at another aspect of the implicit agenda, or the agenda implied in the structure of the visit, which would involve support for friendly, sympathetic, cooperative parties, however you want to put it, in countries where they face significant obstacles to being effective. And I'm thinking specifically of Iraq, in spite of the Iraqi government, and which is generally, okay, and cooperative, and that's why they're going to be there at the GCC Plus thing. But they face obviously a lot of hurdles. In Lebanon, right? There's even worse situation. Okay, it's clear to me that one of the asks of the administration was more support from Saudi Arabia for these groups. So Saudi Arabia has gone through periods, and other Gulf countries, UAE too, of giving up on these these parties because of their ineffectiveness and their volatility and their fecklessness and other things that are true, often true, and so pull the plug. But that doesn't actually produce good results. The administration asked for more, they got more. But what can be done, if anything, out of all these conversations to strengthen constructive forces, if I may use that term, in countries like Iraq and Lebanon? And Danielle, do you want to take a stab at this?
You can see my skeptical look.
I can indeed.
I was trying to think, I know I don't have a poker face at all. I was trying to think who the constructive forces are in Lebanon. I guess I know some of them in Iraq, although they're becoming less and less constructive over time. Here's my problem, Hussein. I have often wondered aloud to our friends in the region why it is that they are not more supportive of constructive forces in a variety of places. I think the Saudis have engaged more in Iraq, although perhaps not decisively for obvious reasons. But whenever I ask that, I am reminded of what horrible, execrable taste they have in constructive forces. This is the challenge here, right?
The menu is not extensive.
Well, but I mean, look, let's look at what is going on. For example, let's set aside Lebanon, which I have said more than once, I think is a completely lost cause, much to my horror and regret, I should add. But let's look at Syria.
100% disagreement, but go ahead.
I know you and I need our own hour and a half to fight that out. But setting aside the question of Lebanon, and I wish you were right and I was wrong. But look at Syria. Here we see the kind of back and forth that our friends in the Emirates and the Saudis have engaged in. And I'm not entirely persuaded that their interventions have been either helpful or valuable. And that's part of the problem. What you would like to see is the United States engaged appropriately, proactively, not pivoting, but actually chewing gum and walking between Russia and China and the Middle East, understanding that where we can, we should build coalitions to support a more constructive path forward, whether in Lebanon or in Iraq or anywhere else.
Syria, I think, is not a... Yeah.
We don't.
I get that. No, I get that. I get that. I don't think you're wrong about that. But Syria is not a great example because there was no effort to do that in Syria. So it's hard to blame others when we didn't even try. But Brian wants to intervene. So please. Yeah.
I think one thing you might expect from this meeting, and again, I think they're still doing a lot of work to figure out what the clear agreed upon outcomes might be, and then what's next, is some form of support from countries like Saudi Arabia and GCC states that have more resources to countries like Iraq and Egypt that are now more resource constrained on practical things like electricity generation and on economic front, food supply, energy issues. The one thing I'd say about, and I'd love to hear Mohammed's sort of reaction to this because I intend it as a constructive criticism, is that I think inside of sort of the Saudi system itself, the government, their capacity to engage the complicated politics of neighboring countries is quite challenged, meaning that, and especially when you measure it up against what Iran does, and I'm not saying it's a good thing what Iran does, they just engage more effectively. When I first went into Iraq in 2003, it was noteworthy to me that Iran and its multiple agencies and other aspects of it had engaged the political system as it was evolving inside of Iraq, and it continued to do so. And we've heard for years sort of Saudi Arabia saying, we're going to get into that game, right? And then we saw certain actions like in 2017 on Lebanon, we saw what their engagement with Lebanon looked like with Prime Minister Hariri and sort of the backlash that provoked. And I don't mean that as—
That was the downside of it, though. Honestly, that's, that was the end.
But my constructive point is that that's ability to sort of shape the political landscape through the considerable resources they have, it seems quite limited. And what's interesting is I think the personnel, there's certainly a new generation coming sort of rising inside of Saudi Arabia. And that's not just MBS, it's within sort of the ministries. And if you know these folks, so the question is, do they have that capacity? And then the question is, in some of these countries, as Danny and you guys have noted, on Lebanon or even Egypt, the politics there are terribly complicated and dysfunctional and in many cases corrupt. The thing that holds back—
they're not that complicated. They're dysfunctional and corrupt.
Yeah,
I mean, Lebanon is not that complicated.
Well, it's complicated for the people of It's complicated for the people of Lebanon who deserve better, right?
I don't like the word. It's a disaster for them. But yeah. But let's get Mohammed's response. This is a great question. I mean, excellent.
I think it's an excellent question, and I also think you hit the nail on the head, Hussein. I think there's disagreement on what's complicated and what's not, right? Lebanon's politics are indeed complicated. There's a lot of warlords. There's a lot of corruption. It takes you a long time to understand what the interest structures are in that country. But is that complication really relevant to anything? The simple fact is Hezbollah controls borders and monopolizes the use of force. The way you define a state is by saying, is there a group that monopolizes the use of force and controls borders? And that's what Hezbollah does. Whether it's in the parliament, whether it's out of the parliament, whether they're fighting with Jaja or not fighting with Jaja, whether they have enough Christians to represent them in the government or not, that doesn't change the fact that their borders they control the borders. It doesn't change the fact that they're in control of the airport. It doesn't change the fact that the country is essentially ruled by Hezbollah. Now, when that rule is threatened, they kill people. And they don't kill only junior people. They also kill people like prime ministers, journalists, politicians, security officials. Osama al-Hassan was the head of security in Lebanon when they assassinated him. So the reality of the matter is it's quite simply a Hezbollah state. That's what it is. And that's the reason Saudi Arabia has decided to disengage from the country. Now, Hussein, in the beginning, you mentioned
hold on. Before you go on, let me just push back a little bit against that, because there are but there are I just want to posit this. There certainly are non-Hezbollah elements. Now, the only alternative to a Hezbollah dominated state is the state itself, a functional state. Otherwise you're going to have that. So I just want to throw that out there. It's not, I mean, that's sort of the counter, and I think it's an important point. Right. But please go on.
No, the counter is well known. Make the civil society stronger. Build
strengthen the army, strengthen the state. Yeah.
But the problem is the army, to a large degree, is beholden to the influence of Hezbollah. The army intelligence is controlled by Hezbollah.
There are elements of it that are clearly not.
The chunks of that army, Hussein, that are not controlled directly by Hezbollah are controlled either by Hezbollah's partners or Hezbollah's indirect bedfellows that are in the security establishment.
I could point you
to think that the LAF is going to be a counterweight to Hezbollah, I think is a lot of fanciful thinking. And at this stage, from my interactions with Saudi officials, the outreach that's in Lebanon is not at this time, does not include support for the LAF or paying LAF salaries. Now, could that change? I don't know. Maybe it could change. What we're seeing the Saudis do right now is because of this dire humanitarian crisis that exists in that country as a result of the Ponzi scheme that's set up by the corrupt political class that was in bed with Hezbollah, people are starving. And these are people that are engineers, they're doctors, and their pensions are not enough for them to feed themselves, let alone their
Can't
family.
get their money out
So
of
what
the
Saudi Arabia is doing right now is trying to find ways to directly aid those people. There's a lot of articles that came out saying that this aid is a life raft for the politicians. It's not. Saudi Arabia is doing this out of humanitarian concerns and trying to give that aid directly to the people who deserve it. So to Brian's point, I don't think the problem with the Saudis' Lebanon policy is that it doesn't have enough foreign policy practitioners or enough people that understand the infinitely complex political landscape in Beirut. I think it's a much simpler policy, and I think it's a correct policy. Now, on Danielle's point on Syria, I think it's important to remember.
After you do Syria, do Iraq.
Sure. I think it's important to note that it's not the Saudis and the Emiratis who are doing whatever their heart desires in Syria. There was a CIA vetting program, and there was a control room in Amman where the United States was leading the charge on identifying which rebel groups would be trained and equipped by the Americans. Now, did the Saudis want to give manpads to the Syrian opposition at various times throughout that civil war? Yes. Did they end up doing it? No, and they didn't end up doing it because the Obama administration warned them not to. I can't say the same for other Gulf countries. The UAE also didn't do it, but other Gulf countries were always, caught red-handed doing that, regardless of what was agreed in that room in Amman. On Iraq, Saudi Arabia is looking for avenues of cooperation, and Iraq, indeed, of course, is not Lebanon. It's more strategically important than Lebanon. Syria is more strategically important than Lebanon. Finding the right people in Iraq is very difficult, and Danielle touched on this. Is Muqtada al-Sadr the right person? I don't know. Probably not.
What day of the week is it?
Exactly. Exactly. The rest of the political class. Kadhimi, of course, his heart is in the right place. He is an ally of the United States. He is an ally of the Gulf countries. But he's under threat himself. I mean, there was an assassination attempt on Mustafa al-Kadhimi's life. So again, to Brian's point, I don't think that the lack of engagement in these countries that are bordering on becoming Iranian satrapies, I don't think the lack of engagement is a function of a lack of enough foreign policy expertise among the top brass of foreign policy practitioners in Saudi Arabia. I think it's a function of realities on the ground, where in Iraq, the monopoly on the use of force is exercised by these PMUs that have been brought into the government. And in Iran, Hezbollah is wholly in control of that country.
Okay, so
one can disagree with this assessment, but I don't think that this assessment exists because people don't know what they're talking about.
No, I think it's a fine assessment. I mean, within the limits that I was mentioning. But Danielle, you want to intervene? And also, I mean, again, I'd like to, at some point, fold this back into the visit. We've gone a little far afield, but not really. So the question is, how does this apply? But please say what what occurs to you.
Thank you. I mean, look, Mohammed, I understand what you're saying about us asking or asking you to, or asking you not to do certain things. We are nothing if not capricious in our habits of foreign policy. But I do think that the point that Brian makes is a very important one for us to make to our friends, whoever they are, in the region. We've done a ton of work on this. I've written 2 reports over the last 15 years or so and haven't done one recently, but nothing has changed. Iran is actually, I don't want to call them masterful, but let's call them capable on soft power. They are shrewd about integrating their economic fate with others. They have integrated electrical networks. They've integrated gas lines. They've integrated road systems with either Syria, with Iraq, with others. They are actually, I mean, they're not as good as they say they are, but they're actually quite good. And I would say that actually the Gulf countries, the GCC countries, are not good at that. They tend to view all of their relationships in terms of hard power. And in fact, early on, after the signing of the Abraham Accords, it was one of the things the Israelis commented on, was, gee, everything they want from us is kind of military. I think the UAE has moved beyond that, but it is interesting. And you see that in terms of Saudi Arabia's relationships in Africa and in elsewhere as well. They're highly militarized as opposed to soft power.
There's a third model, which is the Turkish model, which emphasizes beginning with business ties in these places and then building on that, which is a third approach. Yeah.
Erdogan, of course, is, as you know better than I, a very mixed bag. But all of those things are really hugely important, because one of the things that I think that these countries need to take from the Biden visit is it took a lot to get Joe Biden there. It took what is tantamount to a crisis to get Joe Biden there. All of the paranoia about the U.S. disengagement, I think, is completely well placed. And I think that's a bipartisan issue. I think people think that the Middle East is an ill wind that blows no good. We could do a lot more, and we will all agree on that. But if these countries are to evolve beyond the relationship that we have now, one of the ways that they need to do that is to strengthen in that direction. And that's something that wouldn't be stupid for them to raise with their sort of fair weather friends in the White House.
I think that's a really excellent point, actually. I mean, I couldn't possibly agree with you more. Brian, you've been sitting there waiting, I believe, and I'd really love to bring you back in right now.
Yeah, I mean, look, Mohammed, I think we probably don't disagree on the unfavorable landscape for Saudi Arabia in places like Lebanon and Iraq. My point is that that's the product, and I think Danny just sort of said the same thing, that's the product of Iran's engagement with it in a different way. And that's where I think the opportunities for this visit, Biden is going there, I think, for his own domestic political considerations, his concerns about energy prices. But there's an opportunity for Saudi Arabia to play a more constructive role than it has been. And I think it might do so in places like Iraq and Egypt. I mean, it certainly has done things throughout various sort of revolutions that are mixed. And then the Yemen war, I think, quite frankly, Saudi officials tell me that they clearly didn't get it right, and they're trying to find a pathway out of it, right, through a truce. But my point on all of this is that you need to sort of, the phrase I use is not pivot away from the region or rebalance the old phrases. You need to be able to toggle, like on your computer, when you have sort of a function key. And the Biden team needs to do this. And I think this visit is an opportunity for them to do this. My concern is that not fleshing out sort of a clear plan B on Iran, because clearly plan A was we're going to rejoin the JCPOA in a matter of a few weeks. And I think 2021 was a wake-up call on many fronts for the Biden team. And I wish them well, and I hope that it had worked as a supporter of the JCPOA that felt like it had to be improved, right? And it didn't work, but we're still in this phase a year and a half later almost, where the plan B is not clarified. And I think this visit might be part of it. I think what's going on in the discussions in Iran.
That's my theory of the case.
And again, that does not necessarily, we don't need to fall into the old tropes that some people in the so-called, far left and far right, the so-called progressive camp, who are stuck somewhere between 2003 and 2015 in a lot of their concerns and criticisms. The world has sort of moved on. I think that really a much more nuanced, and I'm working on a piece with my colleague Alex Vitaka on this, of what an Iran plan B looks like that actually puts diplomacy first and the people of Iran, as well as our partners in the region, as part of the equation. And here we are 3 weeks before a major presidential visit. I don't think that's fleshed out. If you look at sort of the recent testimonies by Rob Malley and Brett McGurk publicly, it's not. But that should worry all of us. Yeah.
No, okay. So I love it. Right. I agree 100%, ditto everything. But the plan B would look different depending on one key factor. Do you have a regional bloc to work with that's cooperative and relatively interoperable, even in a tacit way with the Israelis, or do you not? Do you have to do it on your own and with small, ad hoc coalitions, depending on which aspect of the Plan B policy you're talking about? This, I think, is the question that they're going to try to answer in the coming, with the visit and aftermath and whatever they're hashing out in the next 2 weeks. That's my take on it, because Plan B could take different forms, whether you have a nascent reviving bloc as in Europe, or whether you're just going to have to do this in an ad hoc way. That's I think that the sort of big picture panoramic view of the problem facing this administration today.
I think that's right. I would add to it, and again, I think there's a very slim chance of what I'm about to say happening, because it would require the leaders in Tehran to be more pragmatic about it. But I do think there's a chance that there's an effort here. The whole show of a visit to the region is a last-ditch effort to essentially say, hey, look, you have a pathway here.
I totally think that. Yeah.
Yeah. And the thing I would watch there, and I want to sound naive, because I think Iran consistently has demonstrated over the decades that it's divided itself. It has internal divisions, and there are certain factions. The one thing I'd watch carefully, if you're living in the Middle East, is whether some of those so-called hardliner elements inside of Iran try to turn up the volume in terms of their actions against their regional.
They will. The question is, look at how effective it is, right? So from day one, my point has been the policy would look the same and be the same, whether or not they've given up on Vienna or they need leverage on Vienna. And that's sort of the interesting thing. A lot of times policies look the same, and depending, and the goal is not clear, but it doesn't matter. You can see what the policy would be anyway. I want to talk about infrastructure, but I want to make a quick point about Iran versus the Gulf countries in terms of hard, soft power and infrastructure. Look, Iran has advantages that come from culture, that come from religion, that come from in creating vertically integrated networks. It's more problematic dealing with the Houthis because they're far away and because they're 5 Shias, not 12 Shias. But there are these advantages that the Khomeiniite regime has in dealing with other 12 Islamist Shia movements in the Arab world and the Islamic world, that when the Saudis tried it and the Pakistanis and other Sunnis tried it, you ended up with Al-Qaeda, basically. And that's a lesson that no one has forgotten, right? And that's one thing. The next thing is that the way that they have something that's unique, which is the IRGC Quds Force, which is an expeditionary force devoted to meddling and destroying states. It's a cancer-producing agent in the region, right? It implants cancerous growths in neighboring states in order to, first of all, disable them and then ultimately, hopefully, control them, but in a dysfunctioned way, in a broken, sick way. This is the idea. It's a policy that works okay for an anti-status quo power. Okay, it's fine. What chaos is okay for Iran in certain contexts, not in Syria, but in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen. It's fine. It's great. It serves their interests. I don't think it serves Saudi interests, Gulf interests, American interests. That's why the Gulf countries and the United States are partners. And Iran cannot be a partner either with the United States or with the Gulf countries, because ultimately either your interest is in stability, generally speaking, or your interest is in chaos, generally speaking. So I think the model is very hard to replicate. But I want to pivot, having made that little sermon. I want to pivot to infrastructure. It strikes me that integrated infrastructure in terms of shared electricity grids, pipelines, things like that, are a way of solidifying the rapprochement that exists between Turkey and the Gulf, between Israel and parts of the Gulf, bringing in the Iraqi state, Jordan, Egypt, reviving the Jordanian, Egyptian, Iraqi triangle that used to exist, that was an economic force for these countries. All of that stuff that involves old style infrastructure, new style infrastructure, et cetera. Talk about infrastructure. I know this goes afar from the visit, but it does dovetail with everything we've been talking about. So let's begin with Danielle, and then Mohammed, and then Brian, and then probably be the last question.
Look, Hussein, you heard from what I said before. I think the Iranians have built a very good model, and I think that you put your finger on the problem, which is that actually when the Sunni countries sought to emulate some of Iran's strategizing, they ended up, as Iran built Hezbollah, as Iran has supported Hamas, and we could go on and on, the Saudis built Sunni terrorist groups. Okay, that's not the kind of emulation we're looking for. On the soft power side, on the infrastructural side, I think the biggest limitations in these places is not just capacity, it's also corruption. And, when you talk about Lebanon, geez, Louise, I mean, talk about corruption. But Egypt is not dissimilar. I think Jordan slightly less so. But this is another place where the United States could, if we were actually had our eyes on the ball, if Congress had its eyes on the ball, and that's another part of this problem, we could actually be instrumental in helping to not underwrite. We can let the Gulf countries do the underwriting and help actually with some of the technical aspects of these sorts of negotiations, because I think they are smart and they do give them leverage. They are something that they can offer. But again, we're not on the ball on this.
All right. So my point was that it goes. The reason I went from the Iranian Saudi U.S. division over status quo and stability into infrastructure is that, in my view, leaving the Iranian model aside, which is ultimately a model of controlled chaos, integrated infrastructure incentivizes stability, in my view, generally speaking. I mean, it's a broad generalization. Mohammed, I know you've got to go exactly at the halfway mark, so I'd like to bring you in here to talk about that, how it looks from a Gulf point of view, and any final thoughts you have, because you need to leave it at a hard half hour, and we might have a little space after.
All right, sure. Brian. I think you make an excellent point, Hussein. Chaos is very easy and order is very difficult. And I'm not discounting Iran's successes in proxy building. They do that very well, right? Much to the detriment of all of the states that they destabilize. But I think you're also absolutely correct in assessing that Iran's influence can only be spread when there is a weak central government and when there is chaos, right? They need it. If there is order, if there is a government that controls its borders, even if it's a government that in Iraq, for example, that is sympathetic to Iran, for it to have leverage, to be able to close its borders, to be able to pivot elsewhere if it gets upset with Iran, for example, that's a kind of power that Iran doesn't want from its proxy states or from its followers, right? And so it tries to undermine that. Saudi Arabia is trying to create order. And that's infinitely more difficult than creating chaos. Chaos can be done quickly and it can be done effectively. Order takes time. Institutions building takes time. Yeah. Saudi Arabia has funded proxies before. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, it did so as a joint venture with the United States. And
it didn't work out very well. That's a lesson
later.
learned.
I mean, the consequences of it didn't work out very well. Exactly. But when it contributed to collapsing the Soviet Union, along with the energy policy, it worked at that time.
It's a model that is not to be replicated. The point I'm trying to make is, of course, absolutely, and that's why Saudi Arabia is committed not to replicating. Exactly.
So it's a very asymmetric situation where one can compete with Iran by going and finding radical Sunni groups and funding them and playing the exact game that Iran plays. But Saudi Arabia is deeply committed to not playing that game, and that's a game that is not conducive to keeping the peace within this American the security structure in which America is involved. Right. So that's the main difference. It's a tall order what Saudi Arabia is trying to achieve. And on Yemen, there are many difficulties that are going on in the Yemen war. In the same way that there were many difficulties in the Iraq invasion by the United States, the Afghanistan war. The Afghanistan war lasted for much longer. It claimed many more lives. The terrain is similar. The only real conventional war that was won in the past several decades was pushing Saddam out of Kuwait when he invaded it. So we need to put things into perspective. Conventional wars, especially in asymmetric settings, especially in mountainous settings, are very difficult wars to prosecute, especially when on the cheap you have a group like Iran sending the exact type of missiles and drones that are effective against
the Russia-Iran Hezbollah coalition had an effective conventional war in necessary Syria. It dovetails with the Iraq war, with the liberation of Kuwait.
But was it successful?
Yes.
I mean, what's left of Syria?
Yes, yeah,
What's left of Syria? I mean, Syria is not a cohesive state anymore. And Kuwait's borders are still protected.
No.
Stability was good. I mean,
no, it achieved Russia's goals and many of Iran's goals. It was. Let's be fair. It was successful. The key. No, the comparison is limited goals with limited means and relative success. And the American success in Kuwait is of a magnitude of different order, but you could not deny, I think, to Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia, its victory in Syria. Assad, not so much, but the outsiders, yeah, they did. Mohammed, do you have any final thoughts? Because you have to go. So
no.
Okay, thank you
for having me.
It's been wonderful. Brian, infrastructure and this interplay between soft, sticky, and hard power is a very complicated subject. This is the last one we're going to tackle, but you've been very patient. Please.
Yeah, I think just in closing, Hussein, and thanks again for having me part of this conversation, I do think that we should be modest in our expectations about this one visit. But the visit, if it sets the framework for an opportunities agenda, as I think you're implying on the infrastructure front, I think that's spot on. The center of gravity in the Middle East are the tens of millions of people who are often ignored by their leaders and abused by their leaders and abused by the corruption of their leaders. And that's not going to change overnight. But I do think that U.S. engagement on these issues in a sort of practical way, taking small baby steps, encouraging, cooperation with those leaders and the people who are trying to do things differently, to build things rather than destroy, is an important thing. I would, again, be modest about what the payoff on all of this would be, including in integrating infrastructure. This is going to take years if it even gets off the ground because of the insecurity and the mistrust. But it's the opportunity to make this broad region of the world, the broader Middle East and North Africa, which is only about 10% of the world's population, but is this important hinge point geographically and in our economy, and then on the energy front. It's terribly important in that front. And we've been through a period, especially the last 20 years, of, we can just ignore it or fly away from it. And what I'm saying is that I think this small visit, I'd be modest to what this one visit could do, but that engagement, not through military, but through other means, but with the military still being there, could actually help some of the people of the region help themselves to build something better. So yes, infrastructure could. There's a lot of room for improvement there.
I'd add one. Oh, sorry.
No, but there are risks too. And I'm extreme. I think at any moment, sort of all of this could blow up for a variety of reasons. So I wish the best of luck to those, especially working on the U.S. side of things and the Saudi and Israel too, now their government's collapsing, to actually, and the Palestinians too, to actually provide something of a foothold that helps to expand U.S. engagement, and especially on the diplomatic and security fronts. So go ahead, Hussein.
That's extremely well said. Of course, I agree with all of that. I just only add the sort of religious cultural aspect.
Yeah,
here,
100%.
The impact of this small part of the world that begins in Egypt and ends with Iran on the Muslims of the world, on the Pakistanis and the Indonesians and the Malaysians and the Muslims in Russia, is still enormous. It's how should I say, outsized. It's an outsized influence. So don't forget about culture. Because it's the religiously inflected culture, right? It's not any other part of culture. But the Shias of the world look to Iran mostly, and then the Sunnis are driven by this nexus between Egypt and Saudi, and that's just the way it is right now. So thank you for that, Danielle. I'll give you the last word on the trip and anything else you want to say. It's been great having you, but please go right ahead.
No, I think this has been a wonderful conversation, Hussein. I'm just glad to see you well enough to do this talk, looking like a healthy version of the Unabomber. I'm always happy to hear. I'm always happy to hear what my colleagues have to say. I hope much of this trip ends up not being a surprise to the White House and to the president, as indeed previous outings have been. We'll see. For the Gulf, we are the only alternative. They can't rely on the Russians. They can't rely on the Chinese. That's a game.
And we need them if we're going to be a global power too, because we can't partner with the Iranians and leave things to chance and open the door to the Chinese. So it's for them, it's an existential need. But for us, if we want to be the global arbiter and guarantor, we need them too.
we need them too, and we need to behave like the global power we are, not the school marm scold that we've chosen to be. So yes, I agree.
Absolutely.
Right.
Thank you very much. It's been great to have this conversation. I'm glad to be back. For those who realize I've been missing, I prefer to think of my beard as less a Unabomber or Ayatollah beard and more my hero, Jerry Garcia. I don't resemble him in any other way, but he was a remarkable man. The others can all go to hell. But anyway, it'll be gone by the next time you see me. Thank you all for joining us. And I really appreciate it that Mohammed, Alyahya, Danielle, Pletka, and Brian Katulis will have to do something after the visit, unless it's a total dud, which I think we all agree. We hope it isn't. So thanks very much. We'll have another webinar from the Arab Gulf States Institute very soon. Thank you very much.